Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're going to discuss about transplant shock with orchids, what causes it, what it does, and how to actually avoid it. I'll share with you a few of my tips and tricks, if you will. One of you guys suggested this subject and I thought that was a great idea, particularly because I did have this topic on my little idea list. Yes, I carry such a thing on my phone. Whenever I get an idea, I write it down. This was one of them for a long time. I just didn't get to do it. But since we talked just a little bit about it in the Dendrobium phalaenopsis video, I thought, you know what, it's a good time to share with you my little tips or how I go about things when I'm trying to minimize this shock and having setback orchids. And I do hope you'll find this interesting and useful. So with that said, let's start with a general idea about the subject and what does it mean, what does it do, how it applies to orchids. If you've ever grown any houseplant, you might already know about the term transplant shock. In nature, plants are very stable. If there's one thing that never changes, is the way the roots sit. Leaves might be lost, flowers will fade, winter, spring and summer will come, but the root system will always be there in the ground and pretty much will not be affected by anything unless there is a pest in the soil. But overall, the root system is the most stable part of a plant. With orchids, things are exactly the same, and especially with epiphytic orchids, meaning the vast majority of our collections, root systems are rarely disturbed in any way. The roots attach to trees, rocks, branches, and things of the sorts, and they almost never detach unless the tree itself falls, or the branch rips, or the bark just falls. But for the vast majority of cases, roots are never disturbed. Not in the way we do in cultivation. In my opinion, damaging the root system of an orchid, it's pretty much the ultimate damage you can cause. The root system is the core of the orchid. If we don't have a good root system, we don't really have a good orchid. It can apply to leaves as well, but more over to roots. In my experience, whenever we dealt with damaged roots, recovery was slower than when we dealt with damaged leaves. So since naturally orchids are not adapted to completely change their entire root system once a year or once every 2 years, of course they will respond badly when this happens in cultivation. And even if orchids create new root systems every year, the old root system does still play a major role. The orchid needs hydration and nutrients more and more as it grows more structures. So what happens when we repot orchids? Well, pretty much we destroy the root system and we can cause this so-called transplant shock. In the orchid hobby, we rarely refer to it as transplant shock simply because, well, an orchid can get set back by a million things, and breaking roots is just one of them, like any other. So it's nothing that impresses us really, but we are dealing a lot with setback orchids, and repotting can actually determine a setback orchid due to the fact that this is when we are actually more prone to damaging the root system, disturbing it, scratching it, bruising it, all of these things that orchids really don't like us to do. When it comes to orchids though, transplant shock has pretty bad consequences. Orchids are very slow growers, and once we damage the root system, the orchid cannot function properly, so it will not grow properly. It will start to create smaller and smaller structures, smaller leaves, smaller pseudobulbs. Those structures will not work at full capacity, therefore we will not have a blooming orchid for a lot of time. A year, 2 years, 3 years, depends on the orchid. So it is in our best interest not to induce this so-called shock and to set back our orchid. But fear not, there are a few rules that people invented, or actually proposed, let's call it like that, to keep you a little safer from this transplant shock. There are instances in which you can have zero transplant shock as well, and this is what I am doing and what I've always aimed for, and I succeeded. But even with other types of setups, you can actually work with what you have. I'll give you my tips and I really hope it will help you out. And so overall, the main idea is not to bother the root system, or if we do stress it out and bruise it and damage it, do so at a minimum. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about transplant shock, let's see how to minimize it. So guideline number 1, repot orchids when they're growing in their vegetative season. Most orchids grow faster and more in the warmer months, in spring and summer, so a good time to repot pretty much any orchid would be in spring and even at the beginning of summer. Autumn and winter, depending on where you live, is not really the best of times because temperatures usually go lower and day length is shorter, and the growth of orchids actually decreases in speed. So recovery of an orchid will be slower in the colder months than in the warmer months. However, there are other things you can take into account, such as when new growth starts in the case of sympodials, meaning orchids which produce canes or pseudobulbs or fans, unlike Phalaenopsis and Vandas, which are monopodial and they don't produce these structures. So in this case, it is better to repot right before new roots are created by the new growth. In most cases, this happens when the growth reaches a few centimeters or a few inches in height. At this time, you will see new roots starting to form at the base. But not all sympodials will grow at this moment, and when it comes to Cattleyas at least, you can have new roots growing when the pseudobulb matures, after it blooms, or as it creates another new growth. But that's a different story. Pretty much people are trying to repot, 1, in warmer seasons, and 2, right before or while new roots are produced from the new growth. This is actually meant to minimize the levels of stress and dehydration the orchid will suffer after repotting. Sometimes we will damage the older root systems and there's no way to avoid it. So to minimize what the orchid goes through, we prefer to wait for new roots to be produced. They will grow and they will start to absorb water and nutrients, and pretty much the orchid will not stay without a viable root system for too long. And this is pretty much the logic behind it. The time in which the orchid gets dehydrated decreases simply because new roots are already on the way. Now, this guideline is actually very popular and pretty important for people who grow in classic organic mediums such as bark, coconut husk, even sphagnum moss, but not all the time, because these media are the ones who pose the more breakage risk to roots. Bark, coconut chips, they attach a lot to the roots, they're chunky, and when you try to remove them, you will pretty much damage the velamen. Sphagnum moss, not so much. I personally don't ever have issues with sphagnum moss, but with other organic media that break down and need replacing, it's a rule that people really do follow, and you should follow as well in order to minimize transplant shock. Now, if you're growing your orchids in an organic, specifically something you don't need to remove from the root system, you can absolutely forget about this rule and just repot whenever you feel like. If we don't damage the root system, there is really no reason to wait for the proper time or anything of the sorts. If you want to replace the pot, replace the pot. If you want to center the orchid differently in the pot, you can do so, and pretty much you should have zero transplant shock or setback. And P.S. I do have a video on how I up-pot orchids in semi-hydroponics in clay medium, so I'll link you down below to it. So if you're interested, do visit the description. Now, when it comes to monopodials, such as Phalaenopsis orchids, of course, we don't need to wait for new canes or new pseudobulbs to grow, but we can actually apply the rule that we should wait for vegetative growth. So when the orchid starts to produce new roots and new leaves and is done blooming, that's pretty much a very good time to repot a Phalaenopsis orchid. However, once you get more experience with Phalaenopsis, you will notice that it really doesn't matter all that much when you repot phals, because they have such a strong root system, it barely gets damaged at repotting. Unless something happens to the root system, Phalaenopsis orchids bounce back so fast and they don't really suffer from setbacks simply because the root system is very vigorous. So you can see the relation between roots and the transplant shock. The less you damage the roots, the less transplant shock you'll have. But even with monopodials, you should really apply guideline number 2. When you repot your orchid, make sure that you soak the pot thoroughly before starting the repot. Soaking the root system and making it wet will make it slightly more flexible, and also in the case of organic medium, the pieces will expand a little bit with water and they will simply detach just a little bit on their own, or make the pieces detach a lot faster. Working with dry medium is sometimes impossible, such as sphagnum moss, while in the case of bark and coconut husk, it's really detrimental. When roots are dry, they are actually a lot more brittle than when they're wet. So whenever we repot orchids, even I soak the root system very well for 10 minutes or so. If you're working with bark and coconut husk, it is a good idea to actually soak it in a separate bowl. If you have moss, it's not necessary, just run water and make sure the moss is wet. and afterwards start to repot. If you've never experienced this, go and wet a root of a Phalaenopsis and then touch it. You'll feel it's really slippery. It's like it's coated with soap or something. Well, that makes the velamen more elastic, and the more elastic something is, the less likely it is to snap or to get bruised and damaged. So that's the whole reason we soak orchids, and this doesn't only apply to Phalaenopsis, it pretty much applies to anything. There might be just a few cases when it's better to work with dry medium, but at least with organic medium, it's always best to work with it soaking wet and to soak the orchid before we actually work with it. Guideline number 3, and this is something that I apply, it's not something that the articles will necessarily tell you to do. I say be very gentle with the root system and take your time when you are removing the sphagnum moss or bark pieces, because if you rush, you are more at risk to damage the root system. For some orchids, this might not matter all that much if you're gonna lose the old root system anyway, but for others, it really does make a difference. And P.S., I did make a video just a few weeks back about removing sphagnum moss from Cattleya roots. If you don't know, Cattleyas are really sensitive when it comes to roots, and many of the times when we repot Cattleyas, they start to decline very fast because they lose the old root system. Well, in my experience, if you go about it really carefully, you can actually save the Cattleyas from having setback as well. So do check that video below to see my technique. I personally like to work with sphagnum moss, and I don't think it damages roots when we remove it. When it comes to bark and coconut husk though, it's really hard not to damage the root system, but I would still try it. When we remove the pieces of bark, we need to just wiggle them gently until they come off from the roots. And even though the process might be laborious and might take a while, I always find that it pays off. Maybe with Phalaenopsis, which are just so vigorous and have sturdy roots, maybe this is not so important, but especially with Cattleyas, it's really important. They really lose those roots. With Oncidiums, it's important as well. And I just believe that saving the old root system, at least for a while, and we'll discuss about this, will make a huge difference in the overall recovery and evolution of your orchid. So when it comes to organic medium, you know, it's always better to remove as much of the old medium as possible because it's broken down, it's acidic, there's no point in keeping any of it, really. In my experience, it does more harm than good. I've never experienced any benefits of actually keeping the old medium, but if there are just a few pieces attached to the roots that simply don't want to come off, just let them be. If you're gonna repot into bark, that's okay. You don't need to remove anything. As much as you can, that's perfect. But leaving too much of the old medium will lead to some fungal blooms, if you will, in your pot. These are saprophyte fungi. They feed on whatever is decomposing, and even if their presence doesn't really damage orchids, it does mean that you have decomposing medium there that will acidify the whole environment, and it will really damage the root system. So overall, it is a good idea to remove as many pieces as possible. If you cannot remove 3 or 4, that's okay. Better to save the root system. Just do the best you can. So until now we talked about mechanical stuff more or less, but let's talk about something else. The medium we're gonna choose. If you are not experienced, you don't know exactly what to go for, but you've been working with bark, let's say, and you did well with it, well, repot your orchid in bark. If you make experiments and you change the medium to something your orchid is completely not adapted to, the old root system will die off and you'll come back to step 1, damaging root system. It's the very same outcome. Now, when orchid roots grow, they adapt to whatever environment they're growing in. If you have a high moisture environment, they will adapt to that. If you have a very airy and pretty droughty environment, they will adapt to that. And when you suddenly change this environment, they will not react okay, and most of the times they will die. So to give you some actual examples, say you have an orchid in sphagnum moss, let's say a mini Phalaenopsis. I do get a lot of comments about this. You have it in sphagnum moss, but then you read that sphagnum moss is actually not that great for Phalaenopsis and you repot it in bark. Now, is it great? Is it not great? That's all variable. Sphagnum moss is actually pretty great, but it might not work for you. I'm getting sidetracked. So this is something many of us, I think, have already done, putting a mini Phalaenopsis in bark after we pluck it out of sphagnum moss. And a month later, we're seeing that the roots are dying off and the orchid is declining. What's happening? Well, the root system is simply not adapted to bark. Bark is so much more different than sphagnum moss because it's very airy, retains almost no water, while sphagnum moss retains a lot of water and delivers moisture 24/7 until it dries out. So when the root system experiences this sudden change, it cannot adapt just like that. Adaptation comes in time, comes as structures grow and form. Rarely do they adapt just like that. So if there is too much difference between the two media, you might actually end up with some dead roots. Now, Phalaenopsis are pretty resilient and they will bounce back, but there are things that will not bounce back for this. So when we change medium, we need to think about the medium we are going to change into. If you're a beginner, inexperienced, and you just saw somebody on the internet using leca, don't really just go and pluck everything into leca because it's good. Think a little bit about what is happening, what your orchid is planted into, what you have most experience with, what you have most availability, and if you still decide to go and change the medium completely, do so gradually or expect the orchid to either be set back, either have some difficulty in adapting to the new environment. The ratio between air and moisture is pretty much what determines if the roots will adapt or not. There are some other theories regarding pH, regarding other things. I've never noticed them to be a major factor. I personally don't believe that the chemical composition plays an important role. Yes, make sure that the new medium is not toxic or damaging in any way, but if it is within limits, within standards, it really doesn't affect the roots all that much. The main thing that will affect them is the air-moisture ratio and how similar the new medium is with the old medium. Speaking of which, the fifth point would be to adapt the orchid to the new medium if it is very different, gradually, or to be mindful about it. And this is something that I do. You might know that I kind of have all my collection in semi-hydroponics, but these orchids are coming from bark, from sphagnum moss, all types of very different media. Now for me, semi-hydroponics is somewhere in the middle. It is very airy, but it can be very wet as well. It depends on me as well. So depending on what type of environment my orchids are coming from, I kind of work at least in the first few months with the orchid. If I know that an orchid is coming from bark, I will not go out of my way to maintain my medium super wet. But if I know that the orchid is coming from sphagnum moss, I'll make sure that it doesn't go very dry. So I'm gonna try to mimic a little bit the levels of moisture and humidity they've experienced before. And I do this at least a month or two, or maybe even longer, just to give the orchid time to prepare new roots that will adapt a little bit more to my new medium. Of course, I'm not keeping the levels exactly the same as they were because I want the new root system to adapt to this medium, but I do work a little bit with the orchid simply because I want to maintain that root system alive just a little bit longer for the orchid to produce a new root system, which will be adapted and pretty much end of story when the new root system appears. So if you're going to repot an orchid from sphagnum moss to bark, make sure that you don't let the orchid dry for 4 days. In bark, things will dry out a lot faster. If in moss you water it every 7 days, in bark you'll pretty much have to water every 2 days or 3 days, depending on your environment. It's not always going to be the case, but sometimes it will. So when you do this major change, which by the way you can do if you keep in mind you're making a change and you know what you're doing, but work a little bit with the orchid and adapt it gradually to the new medium you are offering. If you're offering sphagnum moss from bark, make sure that you don't add a lot of sphagnum moss, you don't compact it. And when you water it, don't soak it until it cannot breathe anymore. Maybe just water it lightly. Run a little bit of water on top of it, don't soak it, or put some water in the tray, let the sphagnum moss absorb it. Yes, sphagnum moss can do that. In any case, work with the orchid to try and adapt it gradually, keeping in mind moisture and air. As I was saying, other factors don't seem to be as important to me, but the water and air ratio really is. And the more you can keep the root system alive, the older root system alive, the more the orchid will get hydrated and have enough energy to produce a new root system. If you would lose the old root system, of course, you will go back to square one. And a seventh guideline, a last guideline, again, this is something that I do sometimes with some orchids, such as the oncidiums with massive root systems. I am repotting the orchid with its massive roots, but I know that within a month, most of that mass might be dead. And this happens no matter what the medium is. So I am prepared after a month or even 2 to go back and cut away the old roots. Now, when we deal with very bushy rooted orchids, such as oncidiums, it's hard to tell which roots are dead, which roots are alive. And if we're dealing with 1,000 roots, nobody has time to check each one individually. What I do is pot the orchid as it is with its massive roots, even if they're not all going to make it, but after a month or 2, it will be a lot easier for me, because in a month or 2, roots will start to branch, new roots will start to grow, and the older roots, which are not alive anymore, will brown a little bit more, and it will be much easier to see which root is not growing, which one is more brown, which one is more papery. And after a month or 2, I do cut them away and I put the orchid back. When I repot these types of orchids, I want to give them the best chance to get hydrated and not to be set back. And I will make a separate video because I already know this one needs some attention. It's been more than 2 months, but hey, better late than never. I prefer to give the orchid the best chances at the beginning, and then when it has roots and when it becomes plump and nice again, I can go back and cut away whatever is dead without actually damaging the new root system. If I were to cut all of these roots, which are questionable from the beginning, I might cut away, let's say, 3 roots. That would make it, and those 3 roots can make the difference between a setback orchid and a normal looking orchid. So in that case, with pot-bound and massive rooted orchids, I do keep the roots that look okay-ish, but then I re-repot after a month or 2. And that has been working pretty great for me. And as I was saying, I think we're gonna take this one and re-repot it. Look at that. I don't have any setback on this orchid. This is a Tahitian dancer, but I assure you I have a mass of dead roots inside, but we're gonna see in a few days. So this has been the video for today. These are the things that I try to keep in mind when I repot orchids. As I was saying, when it comes to semi-hydroponics, we're working with clay medium. It never decomposes. Things are a lot easier for me. And even though repotting and all of these things can be therapeutic, and they were for me as well at some point, there's nothing wrong with repotting with organic medium and things of the sorts. At some point, I just outgrew it. And right now, I prefer to enjoy other things or to learn about other things than to spend my time repotting, making sure the orchids don't get set back and so on and so forth. And with semi-hydroponics, I did achieve that. It's such an easy life to repot orchids, up-pot orchids. I don't need to worry about transplant shock and all of those things. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with finding joy in repotting orchids and making sure that all of these details are met and so on. It is therapeutic, and yeah, I went through it. I just got out of it at some point. I want an easy life with my orchids now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned something new, and you know the drill. If you've enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, Q&As, tutorials, discussions like this. And also, if you'd like YouTube to notify you whenever I upload a video, just make sure that all notifications are on for my channel. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!